Imagine the roar of 50,000 spectators cascading down the marble tiers of the Colosseum. Trumpets pierce the air. Somewhere in the dark corridors, beneath the arena floor, two men brace for battle. They are not soldiers or knights. They are gladiators, half-starved and entirely expendable. This was not sport as we know it. This was calculated, state-sponsored slaughter, choreographed for a people addicted to blood. To be a gladiator was not an honor, it was a sentence. The arena was not just a battleground. It was a prison, a stage, and a grave. Gladiators did not fight for ideals or kings. They fought for survival, often under the lash of cruel trainers and the leering gaze of Roman citizens. They were expected to die well to make their deaths entertaining. Cries of pain and victory echoed against the stone, and the sand beneath their feet was soaked in sweat and gore. Every swing of the sword, every drop of blood, was met with gasps or cheers, and yet, behind the drama was a daily reality of terror, humiliation, and bodily destruction. Popular imagination has often romanticized the life of a gladiator. Modern films depict them as noble warriors, freedom fighters, or reluctant heroes rising against tyranny. But the truth was uglier and far more tragic. Most gladiators were slaves, stripped of identity, trained in brutality, and owned by men who viewed them as little more than flesh to be wagered. Few ever made it out alive. Fewer still died on their own terms. The spectacle of gladiatorial combat wasn't simply entertainment, it was a tool of control. It reminded Roman citizens who held power and who did not. It displayed the might of the empire through domination, even if that domination came in the form of a wounded man collapsing in front of a howling mob. In Rome, violence was culture, pain was public, death was performance. The arena itself was a marvel of engineering and cruelty. Beneath the floor of the Colosseum ran a complex series of trapdoors, pulleys, and elevators. Wild beasts could be released at a moment's notice. Opponents could be swapped out. Executions could be staged with theatrical flair. It was a machine of death designed for maximum spectacle. And the gladiator, he was simply one replaceable cog in the engine. Spectators came for the thrill, but stayed for the blood. The games often lasted for hours, sometimes days. Morning shows involved animal hunts and executions. The afternoon was reserved for the main event, man versus man. Occasionally, matchups were fair. More often, they were not. One man might be armed to the teeth, the other given little more than a net or a dagger. These weren't contests, they were sacrifices. What did it feel like, stepping into that pit? The heat, the stench, the roar of the crowd, it must have been overwhelming. Some vomited before combat, others wept, a few raged, but all knew this. One misstep could mean mutilation or death. No matter how well you trained, luck was a fickle thing in the sand, and mercy, that was in the hands of an emperor, a mob, or a thumb pointed down. Not all fights ended in death, but even a victory could mean crushed bones, severed limbs, or permanent injury. The lanista, the man who owned the gladiators, might patch you up if he thought you were still worth something. Otherwise, you'd be discarded, left to rot with the rest of Rome's forgotten dead. And there were many. Mass graves lined the outskirts of cities, filled with the broken bodies of those who once thrilled the masses. The myth of the glamorous gladiator fades quickly under the weight of these truths. They were not champions, they were not rebels, they were tools, spent and discarded. Their blood was currency, their pain a performance, and their humanity an afterthought. The Roman arena was not a cradle of glory, it was a factory of suffering. And for those trapped in its jaws, there was no such thing as a happy ending. The fate of a gladiator often began long before he ever saw the inside of an arena. For most, there was no glorious decision, no brave volunteering for battle-only capture, chains, and the slow erasure of their former lives. Many were prisoners of war, seized in Rome's endless campaigns across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Gauls, Thracians, Numidians, entire tribes were harvested for their strongest men, who were then sold into the arena like cattle. Their names were replaced with numbers or cruel nicknames, their identities stripped in favor of spectacle. Others found themselves condemned to the games as punishment. Rome's legal system was swift and brutal. Crimes ranging from theft to desertion could result in death by combat. These damnati ad lidem, or condemned to the game, were rarely given proper training or armor. They were tossed into the arena as little more than living props, fodder for a more seasoned killer or hungry lion, execution dressed as entertainment. Still more were born into it. Children born to enslaved gladiators, known as verni, were property from their first breath. Many were raised within the walls of the ludus, the gladiator training school, knowing nothing of freedom. These boys learned to fight before they learned to read. Their toys were wooden swords, their lullabies, the screams of injured men. For them, violence wasn't a job. The Roman state did not shy away from the blood it spilled. Instead, it institutionalized it. Gladiatorial games were part of the official calendar, sponsored by emperors, magistrates, and aspiring politicians looking to curry favor with the masses. These weren't rogue brawls, they were civic events, sanctioned by law and funded by the state. To feed this unholy machine, Rome needed bodies, and it found them everywhere. Some men did volunteer. Desperate citizens, buried under debt or disgraced by scandal, could choose the arena as a twisted form of redemption. Known as octorati, these men sold their freedom for a chance at glory, or, at least, a roof and regular meals. But make no mistake, this was not an act of courage so much as a plunge into the abyss. They signed contracts that gave up all rights, even over their own deaths. Regardless of how they arrived, every new recruit was treated the same once they passed through the gates of the ludus. They became property bought, branded, and broken in. Some were paraded in chains to show off their quality to Roman patrons. Others were beaten immediately, not for punishment, but to remind them who owned them. It was not enough to be captured. You had to be humiliated. Families were torn apart. Men were renamed, recostumed, reshaped. Sometimes, if they had distinctive features, unusual height, striking scars, or noble bearing, they would be assigned specific roles in the arena. A towering Gaul might become a fearsome secutor, a wiry Greek, a nimble Retiarius. But these roles were never chosen, they were assigned. The arena was theater, and the gladiator was the actor, weapon, and victim, all in one. Some tried to resist. A few escaped. Most who did were hunted down and publicly executed. Rome could not afford to show leniency, not in a system where control was built on fear. Stories of breakouts and suicides circulated among recruits like whispered prayers. The idea of dying on your own terms, or denying the mob its feast, was a dangerous dream, but many dreamed it nonetheless. To be born into the arena was to be born into bondage, And whether one arrived there through war, crime, debt, or birth, the result was the same. You were no longer a person, you were a commodity. Flesh to be broken, blood to be spilled, a brief flash of violence to fill the boredom of Rome's citizens. For the gladiator, life didn't begin in the arena, ended there. The path to the arena often began in silence. A child, stolen in the night, a teenager marched from a burning village, or a boy born to an enslaved mother within the walls of a gladiator school. For these youths, the world was already unforgiving, and it was about to get much worse. The Roman machine didn't wait for you to grow into manhood before it turned you into a product. If you were strong enough to lift a wooden sword, you were strong enough to bleed for an audience. Boys between the ages of 12 and 17 were highly prized in the gladiator trade. Young enough to be molded, old enough to endure the punishing regimen. Lanistas, the owners and trainers of gladiators, saw potential in youth not only in their stamina and resilience, but also in their longer shelf life. A boy broken early could be made to fight for years, bringing in profits with each battle won, each ticket sold. Training began immediately. There were no adjustment periods, no orientation sessions. From the moment a boy entered the ludus, he was stripped of any possessions, bathed, branded, and assigned a cell. His head was shaved, his old name discarded. New names were often crude or mocking: Felix for the unlucky, Bestia for the timid, Spiculus for the lean and sharp. It was identity erasure at an industrial scale. Each morning began before dawn. The clang of bells summoned the boys to a dirt-packed yard where they performed drills until their arms ached and legs buckled. Wooden practice swords, called rudies, were weighted to be heavier than real weapons, forcing the boys to build unnatural strength just to wield them. They sparred with straw dummies and later with each other, the blows growing less restrained with every passing week. Disobedience was punished swiftly and publicly. A boy who faltered in drills might be beaten in front of his peers, or worse. Locked in isolation, with nothing but water and dry bread for days. The goal was to eliminate hesitation, fear, and compassion. You weren't just being trained to fight. You were being reprogrammed to kill without pause. Friendships sometimes formed in these early days, fragile bonds forged through shared pain. But even these were dangerous. A trainer might pit two friends against each other in a sparring match, pushing one to break the other. Mercy was forbidden. Compassion was weakness. In time, the boys learned not to care, not to feel, not to remember who they had been. Some cracked under the pressure. Suicides were not unheard of, even among the young. A boy might slit his wrists with a sharpened bone or hurl himself from the practice scaffolding. But these deaths were not mourned. They were treated as waste and investment gone bad. The remaining trainees were reminded that the dead had failed, and failure had no place in the ludus. The physical toll was staggering. Even before they ever faced an opponent, the boys' bodies were already battered, twisted ankles, cracked ribs, infected cuts. There were no rest days, no healing time. The constant bruising wasn't a side effect. It was the system working as intended. A gladiator's body was meant to be calloused, hard, unyielding. Pain was a teacher. Suffering was a rite of passage. Some of the youngest would be made into pigniari mock fighters who performed in comic matches meant to amuse the crowd without bloodshed. These boys dressed in exaggerated armor and mimed battle in parody of the real thing. It was a temporary reprieve, but one that rarely lasted. Sooner or later, the laughter faded, and the blades grew sharp. Every boy knew his time would come. To grow up in the shadow of the arena was to grow up without tenderness, without warmth, without safety. These were not boys who dreamed of futures. They were children conditioned to survivant till they couldn't, and even in the rare case that they lived long enough to become men, their childhoods would remain buried somewhere deep beneath the sand. The Ludus, or Gladiator training school, was less of a school and more of a factory one that turned broken men into blood-soaked performers, hidden behind high stone walls, often in the outskirts of a Roman city. The Ludus was a world unto itself. It had its own rules, its own hierarchy, and its own peculiar rituals. From the outside, it might have resembled a barracks or monastery, but inside, it pulsed with sweat, agony, and the ever-present drumbeat of approaching death. At the heart of every Ludus was the lanista, the master and owner. He was not just a trainer. He was a businessman, a warden, a talent scout, and sometimes a sadist. He bought and sold men like livestock, calculated their value based on performance and scars, and wielded absolute authority. A lanista could punish, reward, or kill at will. To cross him was to court a slow, painful, and often as a warm-up act for more popular games. Training in the Ludus was relentless. Mornings began with conditioning, running laps around the yard with heavy stones tied to the wrists, practicing balance while walking on narrow beams, or striking padded poles for hours until the shoulders went numb. By midday, the real work began: sparring, footwork drills, and technique sessions under the hot Mediterranean sun. There were no short lessons, no encouragement, only repetition, correction, and consequences. Each recruit was trained in a specific gladiator type based on his build, speed, and background. A tall, heavy man might become a murmillo, carrying a thick rectangular shield and wearing a fish-shaped helmet. A lighter, agile man could be shaped into a retiarius, armed with only a net and trident, fighting bareheaded in mockery of the naked fisherman he was meant to represent. The types weren't just about combat style, they were characters, roles in a deadly drama. The armor itself was designed not for protection, but for theater. The galea, the helmet, often covered the entire face, dehumanizing the wearer and turning him into a living mask. Arm guards, shin guards, and chest pieces gleamed in the sun but left vital areas exposed, ensuring that wounds would come quickly and blood would flow freely. Gladiators weren't meant to last. They were meant to impress. Discipline in the Ludus was brutal. Any sign of laziness or defiance was met with beatings, lashings, or starvation. Some lanestae employed psychological punishment as well, forcing a man to spar endlessly with no rest, or making him stand in full armor under the sun until he collapsed. Others turned punishment into spectacle, forcing the entire school to watch as a comrade was whipped or branded. Humiliation was part of the training. It was how you learned your place. Despite the cruelty, camaraderie sometimes bloomed in the cracks. Men bonded over bruises, shared food when rations were tight, or covered for each other during inspections. Some saw their fellow gladiators as family, the only family they had left. But those bonds were always fragile. At any moment, two brothers in arms might be forced to fight each other to the death for the crowd's pleasure. The Ludus didn't allow for permanent alliances. In rare cases, retired gladiators who had survived long enough were kept on as instructors. These grizzled veterans, called doctors, taught not only technique, but survival: when to take a fall, when to push for a kill, how to manipulate the crowd. They were part coach, part ghost, living reminders of what a lifetime in the arena did to the body and soul. Some limped from shattered knees. Others had only one eye, or fingers fused into useless claws. They taught with scars. The ludus was more than a training ground. It was a crucible. Every groan, every scream, every drop of sweat was part of the transformation from man to monster, from person to product. Once you stepped inside its walls, you stopped being human in the eyes of Rome. You became a gladiator, and the ludus never let you forget it. To keep the blood flowing in the arena, the body had to be kept strong, but not lean and not quick. The ideal gladiator, in the eyes of his owners and trainers, was a slab of moving meat, slow, dense, and resilient to wounds. Thus, the gladiator's diet was designed not for agility, not for energy, but for mass. The Romans even had a name for them: hordeari, the barleymen, not out of affection, but because their bellies were filled with the cheapest grain Rome could offer. The foundation of a gladiator's meal was barley, milled coarse and cooked thick into porridge. It was heavy and monotonous, eaten 2 or 3 times a day. Occasionally it was baked into dense loaves, still warm from the communal ovens of the ludus. It was not a food of luxury, but of practicality. Barley was filling. It made the body swell. It layered the fighter in fat, not muscle, but soft tissue that paradoxically helped them survive slashes and cuts in the arena. Blood flowed slower through fat. The spectacle could last longer. With barley came beans, another staple. Lentils, chickpeas, and broad beans provided crude protein, though often accompanied by bloating and digestive misery. Meat was rare and reserved only for those who had proven themselves valuable. The occasional cut of pork or fish was a reward, never a guarantee. Most gladiators consumed their protein in the form of legumes, boiled until bland, served with oil, and sometimes sprinkled with vinegar or fermented fish sauce called garum. Calcium was vital to maintaining strong bones for battle, but the diet provided little in the way of dairy. Instead, they were given a strange supplementation. Yes, the ground bones of animals or burnt plant material mixed into drinks. Archaeological findings confirm this unusual practice. Gladiators had higher bone densities than average Romans. Likely, thanks to these gritty ash tonics, they drank their strength from soot and smoke. Water was the standard drink. Wine was diluted and rationed, if it appeared at all. The Lanistae were careful not to let their investments dull their reflexes or cloud their minds with drink. A sober gladiator was a controlled one. Still, some sneaked sips when they could, and veterans were known to down a gulp or two before battle to numb the fear, if nothing else. Hunger was a common companion. The diet may have been filling, but it was rarely satisfying. Between brutal training sessions and minimal variety, gladiators craved meat, sweetness, warmth, comfort, anything to break the cycle of bland mush and bitter greens. Some tried to barter with guards or steal from stores. Others waited for festival days, when leftovers from the patrician feasts might trickle down to the fighters in the form of bones, crusts, or rotted fruit. Food was not just fuel, it was a form of control. The lanista could punish a man by cutting his rations, or reward him with a piece of cheese. A well-fed gladiator was an obedient one till the moment he realized that the next meal could also be his last. And so, men learned not to savor, not to hope. They learned to chew, to swallow, to keep moving. Despite all this, Some gladiators took pride in their physiques. With swelling arms and thick torsos, they cut intimidating figures in the arena. Their bodies were their weapons, their armor, and sometimes their only advantage. A fat belly could turn a lethal stab into a survivable wound. A thick neck could absorb a blow without snapping. In this warped world, softness was strength. Modern depictions often show gladiators with lean, chiseled bodies sharpened like blades. But this is fantasy. The real fighters were bulkier, their forms shaped by necessity, not aesthetics. They were built not to pose, but to endure, to bleed longer, to die slower, to entertain more thoroughly. And their diets, those joyless bowls of barley and beans, were the first step in that transformation. From a distance, a gladiator entering the arena looked fearsome, shining helmet, polished shield, bristling with iron. He seemed a warrior, armored for war, ready to meet death on equal footing. But up close, it became clear that the armor wasn't meant to protect him. It was meant to please the crowd. It was part costume, part trap, carefully designed to make him look menacing, while leaving just enough skin exposed to guarantee a blood show. Every type of gladiator had a specific set of weapons and armor, and each was crafted with more thought for entertainment than survival. A secutor, for instance, wore a large, smooth helmet with two tiny eye holes barely enough to see, and completely stifling in the sun. The design was intentional. He was meant to lumber, to tire, to struggle visibly. His opponent, often a retiarius, wore almost no armor at all, just a loincloth, arm guard, and shoulder shield. He fought with a net and trident, dancing and dodging like a fisherman teasing a whale. Their matchup wasn't random. It was a script. The Murmillo, with his heavy shield and short sword, was another crowd favorite. His towering crest and wide-brimmed helmet made him look like a Roman soldier, but heavier, slower, easier to hit. The Threx and Hoplomachus, inspired by foreign warriors, carried curved swords and spears. Their armor was more decorative than defensive, gilded greaves on one leg, ornate visors, flashy plumes. They were walking metaphors, exotic trophies, paraded before an audience who saw them as curiosities first, men second. Armor was asymmetrical by design. Most gladiators had a single armored arm or leg, leaving the other side exposed to increase the likelihood of visible wounds. The crowd didn't come to see clean duels. They came for blood, for the glint of steel sliding across flesh, a perfect blow to an unguarded thigh, a dramatic shoulder gash. These were the moments that brought the roars. Armor, therefore, protected only enough to prolong the fight, not end it quickly. Helmets were especially cruel. Many were heavy, restricting vision and airflow. In the heat of battle, with sweat pouring and lungs heaving, a man might feel like he was drowning inside his own armor. Worse still, the enclosed design made it hard to hear commands or see faint vital cues in staying alive. A helmet that looked imposing to the crowd often felt like a tomb to the man inside it. Weapons were not standardized either. Some men were given duller blades, especially if the fight was meant to last. Others had intentionally mismatched pairings: a trident against a short sword, a whip against a dagger, to increase drama. The result was rarely fair, but fairness wasn't the point. The crowd didn't pay to see even odds. They paid to see a story unfold: hero versus villain, underdog versus brute, executioner versus prey. Outside the arena, some gladiators were permitted to customize their gear slightly. They might sharpen a blade more finely, add a strap for grip, or adjust the padding inside a helmet. But all of it had to be approved by the lanista, and sometimes by the event organizers. No fighter entered the ring without being carefully curated for spectacle. Their bodies were stage props. Their armor was costume. Injuries were inevitable. Armor offered little protection from broken ribs, deep cuts, or fractured skulls. A poorly timed block might shatter fingers. A misstep could drive a blade into the side. And yet, gladiators were expected to fight on. Collapsing from pain was shameful. Bleeding too quickly was disappointing. The goal was to die dramatically, or if luck held, survive with flair. What little armor they had became a burden. It slowed them, drained them, and offered false hope. There was no safety in steel, no refuge in helmets or shields. They wore them not to protect their lives, but to sell their deaths. And in the eyes of the Roman mob, that made for the perfect show. In the gruesome economy of the arena, gladiators were investments-breathing property with price tags attached. And like any valuable asset, they needed maintenance. But the men who mended gladiators were not gentle healers. They were battlefield medics, butchers with steady hands, and miracle workers by necessity. In this twisted world, surgery was common, painkillers rare, and recovery often incomplete. The Medici, or physicians, assigned to gladiator schools, were a breed apart from Rome's elite doctors. They weren't educated in libraries or trained in the healing temples of Asclepius. Many were former slaves themselves, trained on the job, learning as they went. Their tools were crude: bronze, scalpels, bone saws, hooks, tweezers, and cauterizing irons. Their table was often just a bench or a flat stone slab, and anesthesia, as we know it, didn't exist. When a gladiator was injured, and they all were, eventually he was patched up as best as possible, not necessarily to make him whole, but to make him fight again. Deep cuts were stitched without sedation. Dislocated joints were yanked back into place while the patient screamed or bit down on leather. Compound fractures might be set with crude splints and tightly wrapped linen. Infection was a constant threat. A festering wound could mean death long after the match was over. Broken noses, missing teeth, and split brows were common battle scars. These were rarely treated with any urgency. They became part of a gladiator's visual appeal, trophies of prior violence. But more serious injuries, smashed ribs, gut wounds, shattered femurs required true intervention. Amputation was a last resort, because a man missing a limb was useless in the arena. Often, trainers would rather risk a death than lose a valuable fighter to a permanent disability. Bones that didn't heal properly became twisted or frozen. Gladiators were known to walk with limps, drag injured arms, or fight with makeshift braces under their armor. They were expected to train through pain, spar, even while still wrapped in bloody bandages. No recovery period was guaranteed. You healed fast, or you didn't return at all. Pain relief came in two forms: wine and superstition. Strong red wine was poured over open wounds to sterilize, but it also served to dull the senses when swallowed in large amounts. Some gladiators chewed willow bark for its analgesic properties, a primitive form of aspirin. But more often, they relied on ritual, amulets, prayers, chants, anything to ward off death or lessen the agony. One popular charm was inscribed with the words, "Let blood flow slowly and let no limb falter." Some doctors became minor legends themselves. A skilled medicus could keep a half-dead fighter alive long enough to fight again. earning the favor of the lanista and a place in the strange, violent community of the ludus. These men were not healers in the traditional sense. They were survivalists practicing a form of medicine born from necessity, not compassion. Occasionally, an injury was too severe, even for them. In such cases, the gladiator might be quietly disposed of. He would not be honored, nor buried with ceremony. His body would be carted away to a mass grave, stripped of useful gear, and forgotten. Life after a major injury was rare. The arena had no use for broken men. And yet, within this grim cycle, there were moments of humanity. A doctor placing a hand on a shoulder, a fighter helping bandage his comrade's wound. Small kindnesses in a world designed to crush them. The wounds told stories, but the scars were all that remained. Each one a line in a tale of suffering, patched up not for survival, but for spectacle. In the ludus, healing was never about wholeness. It was about getting you back on your feet long enough to fall again. No gladiator ever fought in silence. Every swing, every scream, every dying gasp was swallowed by the roar of the Roman crowd. It was the mob tens of thousands of spectators, tightly packed in the stands of the amphitheater, that transformed personal agony into public spectacle. The games were as much a performance for them as they were a sentence for the fighters below. Without their approval, no gladiator mattered. Without their roar, no death was complete. From the moment a man stepped into the arena, he became an offering to the crowd. The spectators had been waiting for hours, sometimes since dawn, passing time with cheap wine, street food, and gambling. By midday, they were drunk, impatient, and hungry not for bread, but for blood. Vendors moved through the aisles, calling out odds. Children mimicked the combatants in the walkways. Women, too, watched with unsettling intensity, sometimes cheering louder than the men. Their favorites were known by name, just as modern sports fans follow their heroes. Roman citizens knew the records of their most beloved gladiators, how many wins, what type of fighter, whether he'd spared a downed opponent or spilled his guts for glory. Betting was rampant. Entire fortunes could turn on the flick of a wrist, a missed parry, a lucky stab. The gamblers screamed instructions, curses, and encouragement from the stands, convinced that if they yelled loud enough, they could will a man toward victory or death. The crowd didn't merely observe, they judged. The fate of a wounded gladiator sometimes lay in their hands. If a fighter fell and raised his finger in plea for mercy, all eyes turned to the stands. The spectators would shout, wave handkerchiefs, raise fists, or extend thumbs. Contrary to popular myth, the thumb gestures were complex and varied, not always as simple as up or down. But the meaning was clear enough. The crowd became jury. Occasionally, the emperor overruled them, but more often than not, the will of the mob prevailed. It wasn't always fair. A popular fighter might be spared despite a poor showing. A foreigner, a criminal, or someone accused of cowardice might be condemned, even after a brilliant performance. The audience responded to drama, not justice. A brutal kill, a well-acted death, a theatrical collapse earned more admiration than a swift, clean fight. Gladiators quickly learned that survival depended as much on flair as on skill. A kill delivered with a flourish could save your life. A clumsy blow, no matter how effective, might earn you scorn. The amphitheater amplified everything. Noise, heat, violence. The architecture was designed for acoustics. Every cheer, every chant, every groan of disappointment bounced down into the pit. Gladiators fought under a wall of sounds, sometimes deafening, sometimes eerily silent. When a crowd collectively held its breath before a finishing blow, the weight of that silence could crush a man more than any blade. Not all spectators were anonymous. Senators, priests, and emperors often attended, seated in the shaded minionome primum, away from the sunburnt masses. Their reactions held weight. A nod from a patron could spare a fighter's life. A curled lip could seal his doom. Some emperors were more bloodthirsty than others. Commodus, notorious for fighting in the arena himself, demanded elaborate deaths and staged spectacles that blurred the line between execution and sport. For the gladiators, the crowd was both master and mirror. Their cheers offered the illusion of fame, even as their demands ensured suffering. To please them was to live another day. To bore them was to die without applause. Over time, the fighters learned to perform. A pause for effect after a good strike, a shouted boast in Greek or Latin, a slow, dramatic collapse if struck fatally. These weren't just survival tactics, they were part of the code of the arena. And yet, the crowd forgot quickly. A dead man was yesterday's thrill. A new favorite would rise, a new match would be announced, and the blood-stained sand would be raked smooth for the next act. For the Roman mob, the games were not cruelty, they were tradition, theater, and release. For the gladiators, they were a desperate bid to be remembered, or at least to not be discarded too soon. In the Colosseum, applause was both praise and judgment. Behind the roar of the crowd and the clang of swords, the gladiatorial games were driven by one force above all others: money. The arena was not merely a stage for death, it was a vast, well-oiled economic machine. Every fight, every injury, every drop of blood was tallied in ledgers, priced, insured, and leveraged for power. For the men who never stepped into the sand, the games were not about honor or survival, they were about profit. At the center of this economy stood the lanista, the gladiator trainer and owner. He was a businessman first, often of the lowest social class, yet wealthy beyond imagination if he played his cards right. The lanista purchased fighters, enslaved men, prisoners, volunteers, and trained them not for freedom, but for return on investment. Each match was a wager. Injury meant delay. Death meant loss. Victory meant prestige. Gladiators were expensive to acquire and maintain. Feeding, housing, training, and outfitting them required substantial investment. To offset this, lanista would lease their fighters to games hosted by magistrates or private sponsors. Contracts were signed, conditions negotiated. A particularly skilled or famous gladiator could demand higher fees, or, rather, his owner could. The fighter himself would see little, if any, of that wealth. The most prestigious games were held by emperors or ambitious politicians. These munera were public events meant to curry favor with the people. By sponsoring elaborate spectacles, importing wild beasts, hiring rare gladiator types, staging massive battles, organizers hoped to win votes, loyalty, and fame. The bigger the bloodshed, the better the reception. The crowd never asked where the money came from. Bread and circuses dulled political inquiry. Vendors swarmed the entrances of amphitheaters. They sold food, charms, cheap trinkets, and betting slips. Local economies spiked on game days, inns filled, brothels prospered, markets boomed. Even the sweat and blood of fallen gladiators were sometimes sold as aphrodisiacs or magical elixirs. In death, a man might still turn a profit. Betting was a serious matter. Odds were calculated, bribes exchanged. Sabotage was not unheard of. Sharpened weapons, drugged food, whispers slipped to opponents. A losing fighter meant lost money, and the stakes could reach ruinous levels. While gambling was technically illegal in many provinces, enforcement was lax, especially when the rich were the ones placing the bets. Some gladiators became brand names. Their faces adorned oil lamps, mosaics, and figurines sold to adoring fans. Children reenacted their favorite fights in the streets. Women wrote letters scented with perfume and begged for trysts with famous champions. The irony was thick. Men enslaved, beaten, and bled for profit turned into icons, yet never paid. Their popularity enriched everyone but themselves. In rare cases, a gladiator might receive prize money after a particularly celebrated performance. These winnings were modest and usually held by the lanista as part of a larger scheme to keep fighters loyal or at least obedient. The promise of eventual freedom of erudis was dangled in front of veterans like a carrot before a mule. Many never lived to claim it. Doctors, too, had their role in this economy. A good medicus could extend a fighter's career by months, even years. Their services were not cheap, but neither was replacing a seasoned gladiator. Some laneste kept their own doctors on staff. Others paid freelancers by the wound. Even injury became a transactional affair. The state profited most of all. Taxes, licensing fees, and imperial sponsorships tied the games firmly to Rome's political and financial core. The emperors knew that blood was currency, one that could be spent to silence unrest, to distract from war, or to elevate their own image. Bread fed the body. Blood fed the empire. Gladiators rarely saw the fruits of the economy they sustained. They lived in cramped cells, wore borrowed armor, and were traded like tools. But around them, the business of death thrived. Every cheer was money changing hands. Every death a calculated loss. In Rome, even pain was profitable. And no one knew that better than the men who bled for it. For all its cruelty, the ludus was not entirely devoid of companionship. Among the sweat-soaked training yards and blood-streaked sleeping quarters, a strange sense of brotherhood often emerged. These were men thrown together by fate and shackles, different tongues, different lands, but the same grim future, bound by pain, survival, and the unspoken knowledge that only a handful of them would ever walk free. Gladiators formed bonds that were as real as any forged in battle. In the early days of training, men leaned on each other. Veterans helped newcomers wrap their wrists or adjust ill-fitting armor. Older fighters whispered advice in the shadows, how to fake exhaustion to steal a rest, how to turn a fall into an advantage, how to breathe beneath the crushing weight of a closed helmet. These small mercies weren't kindnesses in the traditional sense, they were strategies. Keeping each other alive meant keeping the odds fair, at least until the arena decided otherwise. Language was no barrier. Gladiators came from across the empire. Parthians, Gauls, Greeks, Numidians, Syrians, Dacians. Some had been aristocrats once, others mere farmers or rebels. They spoke in gestures, in crude Latin, in the dialect of shared pain. Their nights were spent not in silence, but in murmured stories of lost homes, of children remembered only in dreams, of gods long abandoned. In this world of dust and iron, words were rare treasures. Fights inside the ludus were common. A spilled bowl, a careless insult, a perceived slight, they could all erupt into violence. But these skirmishes were different from the arena. They were real. No audience, no drama, only fury, exhaustion, and the deep, gnawing stress of men living under constant threat of death. Yet, just as often, those same men might share food afterward, or stitch each other's wounds with shaking hands. Some bonds grew deeper. There are accounts fragmented, buried in graffiti and second-hand letters of love among gladiators. In a world that offered no gentleness, men sometimes found it in each other. Forbidden, whispered, quickly punished if discovered, but still present. These were lives stripped bare, and love, in whatever form, could be a final act of resistance. But trust, however real, always lived under a shadow. A day would come when two comrades were chosen to fight, and then everything changed. Loyalty bent under the weight of survival. If the crowd demanded blood, a man had to strike. If one begged for mercy, the other had to decide compassion or self-preservation. Some hesitated, some refused, some wept as they delivered the fatal blow. The crowd rarely cared. The arena demanded a finish. For those who survived, the guilt lingered. Men who had once shared food and fear might avoid each other's gaze, haunted by what necessity had forced them to do. Others hardened themselves completely, refusing friendship so they wouldn't have to grieve. A few grew numb, seeing every comrade as a future corpse, every laugh as the rattle before the end. Despite it all, brotherhood endured. It was scratched into the walls of sleeping quarters, marked in secret signs, etched into helmets. Some gladiators died with another's name on their lips. Some carved crude memorials into the wooden benches of the training yard. These weren't just killers. They were men trying to remember they were still human. Outside the ludus, the world saw only savages, brutes, and beasts in armor. But within its walls lived stories of shared bread, whispered prayers, muffled sobs, and clasped hands before the dawn. The arena turned men into monsters, but even in chains, many refused to forget the sound of another voice calling them friend. Because when everything else, home name, freedom, dignity, had been stolen, all that remained was the man beside you. And in the brief, brutal lives of gladiators, that could mean everything. Long before a gladiator stepped onto the sands, the day of the games began with ritual, anxiety, and the low hum of rising chaos. For the fighters, it was a day like no other, final march toward pain, glory, or oblivion. For the city of Rome, it was a festival, streets filled with banners and chatter. Merchants haggled, children played mock battles, and the amphitheater loomed like a stone leviathan, waiting to swallow its daily offering of blood and spectacle. Dawn came early to the ludus on game day. The air was tense. Some men sharpened their weapons in silence. Others whispered prayers to forgotten gods or wrapped lucky talismans around their wrists. Meals were light bread, a smear of oil, watered wine meant not to slow the stomach or encourage vomiting in the ring. The lanista moved through the ranks, inspecting armor, muttering final instructions, or offering curses wrapped in encouragement. A procession often preceded the games. Trumpets blared, and a parade of fighters marched from the ludus to the arena under heavy guard. Some were cheered by name, others booed, their reputations preceding them. The crowd had favorites, villains, unknowns. Placards announced matchups. Painted boards displayed stylized portraits. For many in the audience, this was the highlight of the year, a civic ritual, a political spectacle, a day of sanctioned bloodletting. Inside the arena, the sand had been freshly raked. The scent of iron and dust already lingered in the heat. Musicians played to rouse the mood. Vendors hawked snacks and trinkets. The seats filled slowly, at first nobles and senators, under shaded canopies. Commoners packed into the upper rows. Once the emperor or sponsor arrived, the games could begin. A wave of applause would roll through the amphitheater like thunder, a signal to the gladiators waiting below. The first events were often warm-ups, beast hunts, executions of condemned criminals, mock naval battles in flooded arenas. Gladiators watched from behind grated doors or through slits in wooden gates, hearing the screams and the cheers, smelling blood before they spilled any of their own. Some clenched their fists, some trembled. All waited for the sound of the gate, crank turning metal chains, rising, the door sliding open, and the light flooding in. Entering the arena was a shock. The heat, the noise, the sudden exposure. After weeks or years in the confined gloom of the ludus, the blinding sunlight and tens of thousands of watching eyes felt like a second death. Some raised their weapons with practiced flair. Others walked out solemnly, refusing to acknowledge the mob. Either way, they were now players in the grand theater of Rome. Each match was announced by a herald. The crowd learned the names, origins, fighting styles of the combatants. Bets were placed. Cheers erupted. And then the signal horns, clashing cymbals, or the dropping of a white cloth. The fight began. There were no formal rules. Combat varied, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes team battles, sometimes man versus animal. The goal was not always to kill, but to entertain. A clean kill earned less praise than a drawn-out struggle, a reversal, a dramatic final blow. Fighters who performed well might be granted mercy. Those who bored the crowd risked a swift end. The arena floor was unpredictable. Blood made the sand slippery. Hidden traps or sudden appearances like wild animals released mid-fighted chaos. Fatigue came fast under the weight of armor and adrenaline. A moment's hesitation meant a deep wound. A misstep, and you were on your back, staring up at a sky that seemed to drift farther away with each breath. Defeat wasn't always death. A fallen fighter could raise his finger in a plea for mercy. The crowd would respond, shouts, gestures, sometimes coordinated chants. The final decision rested with the sponsor or emperor, but public sentiment weighed heavily. A spared fighter might live to bleed another day. A condemned one met his end beneath the sword of a man he may have trained beside. After the match, the victor made a circuit around the arena, saluting the stands. If he had killed, he might be handed a palm branch or a laurel crown. If he survived but did not win, he was dragged off, bleeding, possibly dying. Either way, the show went on. The sand was raked again. Fresh fighters readied behind the gates. To the crowd, it was thrilling. To the state, it was a message. This is Rome, majestic, ruthless, and inescapable. To the gladiators, it was a blur of noise, pain, and heat, an endless loop of violence masquerading as ritual. And for some, it was the last stage they would ever stand on. Despite popular imagination, not every gladiatorial match ended in death. But make no mistake, death was always near. It hovered just behind the crowd's cheers, waited beneath the sand, and settled into every corner of the Colosseum like smoke. It was not always swift, it was not always fair, but it was inevitable, because whether the outcome was planned or left to chance, the system was built to end men. Many matches were arranged with a specific result in mind. A popular champion might be paired with an unskilled opponent to ensure a quick and impressive win. Sometimes the match was to the death, sometimes not. But the truth is, a wound that would be survivable today, on abdominal cut, a broken femur, a lung puncture, could easily become fatal in Rome. Even if the crowd or sponsor spared a fallen man, sepsis or blood loss often finished the job days later. There was theater in dying. Gladiators were expected to die well, stoically, dramatically, without begging or tears. A man who collapsed whimpering would be mocked. A man who stood, bleeding and upright, awaiting the final blow with calm resignation, might be remembered. The death pose became part of the ritual. Some fell to their knees with arms outstretched, others folded with weapons still in hand. The moment of death wasn't private, it was choreography. Execution, too, was stylized. If a fighter was condemned, the victor was expected to dispatch him cleanly with a precise thrust to the throat, heart, or abdomen. But that wasn't always how it went. Mistakes happened, blades missed. The dying man twitched and bled slowly while the crowd grew restless. Sometimes, a second man was sent in to finish the Jabba-masked executioner known as the Charon, named after the mythical ferryman of the dead. He carried a hammer or mallet, not to strike the body, but to confirm death. One tap to the skull, one jab to the chest. Ritual cruelty, Roman style. There were rules, technically. Gladiators weren't supposed to fight without armor. Death matches were only authorized under certain conditions. But rules meant little when the crowd was baying and the sponsor wanted a memorable show. If a fighter refused to kill a downed opponent, he might be punished later or killed in the next match for defying the script. Mercy, while sometimes granted, was always conditional. Even the matches that weren't intended to be fatal often ended in serious maiming. A snapped wrist could mean death in the next fight. A crushed knee could end a career. The system didn't care. There was always another body waiting to take your place. Death was not a surprise. It was the final entry in a ledger already filled with wounds. For the spectators, death was the climax. The silence before the final strike, the collective gasp as blood sprayed across the sand. The thunder of applause, all of it reinforced the power of the empire, the value of Roman life over foreign flesh. Executions were met with snacks and song. Children laughed. Lovers embraced. The death of a gladiator was not a tragedy, it was Tuesday. The arena even had its own graveyards. Outside the walls, a short cart ride away, lay mass pits and cremation fields for the dead. If a gladiator was fortunate, a comrade might carve his name into a wooden marker. Sometimes, wealthy fans would pay for a more formal tomb, but most were dumped anonymously, with no eulogy, no rite, their last applause still ringing in the dust. The frequency of death varied by era. In the early days, it was rare. Gladiators were expensive. By the height of the empire, as the games grew more brutal and public tastes more bloodthirsty, death became common. Under emperors like Caligula and Commodus, death wasn't a possibility, it was a guarantee. By then, the arena was less a stage and more a slaughterhouse. The truth was simple. Gladiators were never meant to survive forever. They were meant to die interestingly. If you were lucky, you died quickly. If you were favored, you died famously. And if you were very fortunate indeed, you died just after winning your freedom, with your sword still warm in your hand and your name, for a moment, echoing off the stone walls of the Colosseum. In the cruel paradox of Roman spectacle, some gladiators, though enslaved, brutalized, and battered, rose to fame. Their names were etched into the memory of the crowd, their faces recognized in marketplaces and taverns. But this celebrity was fragile, cruelly conditional, and always at the mercy of the arena's appetite. For every man who earned cheers, 100 died forgotten. Fame, for a gladiator, was both a shield and a chain. Rome was a city obsessed with spectacle. Heroes of the arena became household names, as recognizable as generals or poets. Their images appeared in graffiti, scratched lovingly onto alley walls. Children carved their names into toys. Trinkets bearing their likeness, oil lamps, clay figurines, and cups circulated through the empire. One might see the image of a favored Mermelot alongside a victorious charioteer or an actor's mask. These weren't just killers, they were Rome's brutal celebrities. But this fame brought little comfort. Gladiators lived under constant surveillance by trainers, guards, and the fickle judgment of the mob. A single bad performance could turn adoration to mockery. A once cheered fighter who refused to kill might be pelted with rotten vegetables, booed into obscurity, or worse, condemned to die in the next match. The crowd's love was a flame that burned quick and hottened left ashes when it passed. Still, there were perks. Celebrated gladiators, especially those with winning streaks, were given better food, lighter training, and sometimes their own rooms rather than communal cells. Some even received gifts from patrons' rings, money, small amounts of land, but all of it could vanish in an instant. Fame didn't mean freedom. It meant you were too valuable to kill casually, but still killable, all the same. Some wealthy Roman women were captivated by gladiators. Scandalous accounts tell of noble ladies sneaking into the ludus to consort with their favorite fighters, bribing guards for private audiences, or sending love letters laced with perfume. These stories were passed around with both titillation and contempt. A senator's wife bedding a slave. To some, it was depravity. To others, it was proof of the gladiator's allure, body honed for violence, tempered by pain. There were even rare cases of gladiators becoming lovers or confidants to powerful individuals. One famed Retiarius was said to have caught the eye of a provincial governor's wife. Another was rumored to have fathered children with a wealthy widow. But these relationships were fragile. If exposed, the consequences were dire: public flogging, exile, execution. The law did not permit such unions. Gladiators were property, not partners. For those who survived long enough, fame could lead to freedom. Arudes, the wooden sword awarded to retiring gladiators, was both a symbol and a sentence commuted. It meant you'd fought well enough, long enough, to be granted your life back. Some retired into quiet labor. A very few tried to disappear entirely, change names, leave the city, become anonymous again. But for every man who held Arudes, countless others never got the chance. Their names faded from memory the moment they fell. The blood they spilled soaked into sand that was raked clean and reused the next day. Their moment of glory passed like smoke, brief, blinding, and gone. And even for those who tasted fame, it came with an edge. You might be cheered in the streets and watched with admiration, but you were still property, still a man expected to kill for the entertainment of others. You lived in the shadow of your next performance, knowing that the crowd who chanted your name today might condemn you tomorrow. Fame in the arena was not a triumph, it was a mask. Behind it stood a man with bruised ribs, trembling hands, and a face half hidden by a helmet. A man who had learned that applause, like life in Rome, was never truly yours. It was borrowed, and one day it would be taken back. Despite their shackled existence, gladiators became the objects of fascination, lust, and even reverence within Roman society. Their bruised bodies and proximity to death made them dark, iconistified, feared, whispered about in corners of the forum and boudoir alike. These were not just fighters. They were symbols of raw masculinity, violent allure, and primal spectacle. And in a culture both obsessed with status and fixated on spectacle, that combination stirred an odd mix of scandal and superstition. Roman women, particularly those of the upper classes, were notorious for their interest in gladiators. This was not just idle curiosity. Satirical poets, like Juvenal and Martial, delighted in ridiculing noblewomen who pined for fighters, sneaking love notes to the ludus, or bribing guards for trysts. These women weren't just breaking social norms, they were crossing class lines, so sharply drawn they were considered sacred. A patrician woman lying with a gladiator was, to Roman eyes, an act of degradation, yet it happened often enough to become a well-known source of gossip. Gladiators were muscular, scarred, tan, dangerously different from the pampered, pale aristocrats of the Roman elite. Their bodies bore the marks of survival, and in a world teeming with artificial luxury, those marks were oddly authentic. There was also the psychological thrill. These men lived close to death, had no rights, and were still adored. In the twisted logic of the empire, they embodied the forbidden, but the fascination was also spiritual. Some Romans believed that the blood of a dying gladiator carried sacred power. Women would rush the arena after a fatal match, dabbing handkerchiefs in the blood, collecting scraps of clothing, even scraping up sand-stained red. These relics were kept as charms believed to aid fertility, love, or even protection from illness. The closer a man was to death, the stronger his aura of supernatural potency. Mothers whispered to their daughters that touching a gladiator's sword could bring good fortune. It was macabre, certainly, but in a world where omens and signs were taken as seriously as law, it fit neatly into Rome's web of beliefs. Gladiators, too, believed in omens. Before matches, many followed small rituals, kissing, a lucky token, whispering the name of a dead comrade, drawing sigils in the sand with their blades. They carved symbols into their armor, snakes for cunning, eagles for strength, or crossed lines meant to ward off bad luck. Even within the strict regimen of the ludus, superstition flourished like weeds in stone cracks. Dreams were also taken seriously. A dream of fire might be seen as a warning, a dream of doom. If a fighter dreamed of victory, he might enter the arena emboldened. If he dreamed of a broken weapon, he might beg the lanista to postpone his match. Sometimes they were granted. Other times, dreams were dismissed as cowardice. But no one, especially not the trainers, truly scoffed. They'd seen too many omens come true. Their trainers' mark or a symbol of strength. Others went further, carving protective runes into the grips of their swords, or slipping small bones into their boots as charms. Even in an environment governed by blood and iron, the need for belief endured. In a life so unstable, superstition was a small tether to hope. Of course, scandal also cut the other way. Gladiators who grew too close to Roman women might find themselves punished brutally, not for the affair itself, but for the audacity of transgressing the social order. Some were whipped publicly. Others were forced into hopeless matches as quiet executions. The arena had its own rules, but Roman society's invisible walls were just as deadly. They were symbols of sex and death, violence and power, sacred and profane, all at once. They were admired, envied, used and almost never allowed to forget their place. But the fantasies of a society drunk on its own brutality, even in the shadows of the empire's greatest stone temples and gilded palaces, gladiators haunted the minds of Rome's citizens, not just as killers, but as symbols of everything Rome both craved and feared. Though history often remembers gladiators as hulking men clashing in grand arenas, there was another, far less spoken of figure who bled for Roman entertainment: the gladiatrix, the female gladiator. Rare, controversial, and doubly objectified, these women stood at the edge of Roman spectacle, fighting not only for survival, but against a society that saw their very existence as unnatural. They were anomalies in a world built on rigid gender roles, yet they left undeniable scars on the empire's blood-soaked stage. References to female gladiators are scarce, and that scarcity is telling. Roman historians either dismissed them as curiosities or condemned them outright. Yet, evidence exists in scattered inscriptions, satirical poetry, and one surviving marble relief showing two women named Amazonia and Aquileia in combat. They fought fiercely, we're told, and were granted a draw by the crowd, an honor rarely given to male fighters, let alone women. Where did they come from? Like their male counterparts, most were enslaved. Some were prisoners of war, others condemned criminals, or simply the right to control their own fate, if only in the arena. But whatever their path, their presence stirred discomfort. They were fighters, but they were also walking taboos. Women were expected to embody modesty, chastity, domesticity. A woman wielding a sword, especially in a public, violent context, was an affront to that carefully constructed ideal. And yet, the contradiction was part of the appeal. Female gladiators were eroticized and ridiculed in equal measure. Their armor was often minimal, emphasizing spectacle over safety. They were dressed for the crowd, not the combat. Unlike men, they were rarely trained in standard ludi. Instead, they might be coached in private or in smaller, traveling troops. Some were paired with dwarves or animals, their matches more novelty than true combat. Others were forced to fight each other to women, stripped to the waist, lunging with daggers under torchlight. These were not just contests. They were calculated humiliations designed to titillate and terrify. Still, some fought with skill, some earned reputations. In the provinces especially, where social norms were looser and curiosity stronger, female fighters were sometimes treated with awe. In the Eastern Empire, they may have even commanded cult-like followings. Their names were whispered in the same breath as foreign goddesses and warrior queens. But Rome, ever wary of disorder, did not tolerate such deviations for long. By the reign of Emperor Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century CE, female gladiators were officially banned. The decree cited moral decline and offense to Roman values. But the truth was simpler. Women who fought blurred the lines of control. They refused to remain ornamental. They turned Rome's obsession with domination back on itself, and the empire could not abide that. After the ban, references to gladiatrices faded. Their names were scratched off public monuments, their images removed from mosaics. They became ghosts in the historical record, half-remembered symbols of rebellion. Yet the echoes remain. In carved graffiti, in satirical plays, in the occasional grave marker, hinting at a woman who once fought in the arena. For these women, the arena was a stage of impossible contradictions. They were not expected to survive. They were not allowed to be heroes. They were forced into roles that mocked their gender, then punished for embodying them too well. But in that brief, brutal moment beneath the sun, before the jeers and the blood, before the thumb turned up or down, they stood not as wives, nor slaves, nor property. They stood as warriors. And though Rome tried to erase them, the sand remembers. Before the main events of any Roman spectacle, before the cheers and clamor for skilled combatants, came the executions. They were the opening act, the grim overture to the day's brutality. And for the gladiators waiting in the depths of the arena, these deaths were not just distractions, they were warnings. They were reminders of how cheaply life was valued, and how closely their own fate mirrored that of the condemned. Public execution in the arena was not merely about punishment, it was performance. Criminals, deserters, slaves accused of rebellion, and Christians refusing to renounce their faith were sentenced to die in damnatio, ad bestias damnation, by beastor, in elaborate theatrical killings staged for maximum entertainment. The arena was transformed into a stage for Rome's creative cruelty. At the start of the day, spectators filled the stands early, eager not just for the gladiator matches, but for the executions that preceded them. The condemned were led in chains, some naked, some dressed in mock costumes meant to ridicule their crimes. A thief might be dressed as Mercury, the trickster god, a traitor as a pig, led by a child dressed as a butcher. The crowd howled with laughter, then grew silent as the killing began. Animals were often the executioners: lions, bears, leopards, and bulls, imported at great cost from Africa and Asia. Starved and provoked, they were released into the arena to tear apart their victims. Sometimes the condemned were tied to posts or left defenseless in the center. Others were bound in groups, their cries blending into a chorus of despair. The animals mauled, trampled, shredded. If the beasts were sluggish or merciful, handlers would whip them to frenzy. But not all executions were left to animals. Some were carried out by other humans, sometimes even by gladiators themselves. A fighter might be ordered to dispatch a line of kneeling prisoners with sword or axe. His role transformed from combatant to executioner. Refusal was not an option. Some did it coldly. Others looked away as they struck. A few added flourish, drawing cheers from the bloodthirsty crowd. Other executions were theatrical reenactments. A prisoner might be dressed as Prometheus, chained to a rock while a trained eagle pecked at his flesh. Another might play Icarus, only to be cast from a platform onto spikes. Myth was merged with murder stories made real through pain and spectacle. The audience watched with a mixture of amusement, horror, and detached awe. For the gladiators waiting below, the sound of screaming and roaring from above was impossible to ignore. Some stared at the walls, others gripped their weapons tighter. They knew that while they were more skilled, more trained, more valuable, for now the line between them and the condemned was thin. One wrong move, one failed fight, and they might be next on the chopping block. Execution Day was also a reminder of how deeply violence was embedded in Roman identity. Children watched as men were torn apart. Priests blessed the games. Senators nodded approvingly. Blood was not taboo. It was expected. The arena was Rome distilled power, cruelty, and spectacle, all under the open sky. Sometimes the gladiators were made to clean the sand afterward. With brooms and rakes, they would sweep aside torn limbs and pools of blood. The stench of death lingered in the air as they prepared for their own battles. There was no illusion. Everyone knew what was coming. And yet, when the trumpet blared, and the doors opened for the first true match, the crowd cheered, as if they had not just witnessed multiple deaths. The stage was reset, the blood was forgotten, and the gladiators stepped into a world where death was no longer performance, it was profession. For the condemned, the arena was a sentence. For the gladiator, it was a career. But both knew the truth. The sand did not care who you were. Once you fell, the crowd would turn to the next act, hungry as ever. Amid the relentless violence and crushing despair, there was a glimmer of hope for some gladiators, a chance at freedom, symbolized by the rudies, a simple wooden sword. This humble object was more than a weapon. It was a ticket out of bondage, a passport from the life of blood and pain into one of relative peace. But earning the rudies was no easy feat. It required not just skill, but endurance, luck, and sometimes the favor of those in power. The rudies was awarded to gladiators who had proven themselves exceptional in the arena, surviving many fights and winning the admiration of both the crowd and the emperor. It was a rare honor, often granted after years of brutal service. The wooden sword was a public symbol of manumission, a ceremonial release from the ludus, and the right to live as a free man, though still marked by the stigma of former slavery. Receiving the rudies did not guarantee an easy life. Freed gladiators faced the same harsh realities as other freedmen in Roman society: limited legal rights, social prejudice, and economic uncertainty. Many had no family or trade to fall back on. Some became trainers, passing on their skills to new fighters. Others tried to disappear into the city's shadows, hoping to live quietly away from the arena's glare. The process of earning the rudies was grueling. Gladiators had to demonstrate not only superior fighting ability, but also an understanding of the showmanship required to entertain. They needed to survive injuries that would have ended lesser careers, maintain the favor of their lanista and patrons, and sometimes navigate the dangerous politics of the arena. A single misstep, a lost fight, a scandal, a moment of hesitation could shatter all chances. Some gladiators were granted their freedom by imperial decree, often as political gestures during festivals or to curry favor with the populace. Others bought their freedom, accumulating prize money over years, but most never saw this day. Death was the more common end to a gladiator's story, often sudden, violent, and unsafe. Even after receiving the rudies, many gladiators remained tied to the arena in unofficial ways. They might be called back to fight in emergency matches, forced to serve as trainers or bodyguards, or used as pawns in political games. Freedom was not always freedom. It was sometimes just a reprieve. The wooden sword itself was simple and adorned, functional, yet it carried immense symbolic weight. It represented survival, mastery over death, and the possibility of a life beyond the arena. For a man who had lived with a sword in his hand and death at his heels, it was a rare gift. But for most, the rudies was a distant dream, a whispered hope in the dark, a story told to keep spirits alive. The vast majority of gladiators died young, their bodies thrown into massed graves with no name, no story, no legacy. The few who earned freedom became legends, their names etched into stone and memory. In the end, the rudies was both a promise and a reminder. It said that survival was possible, but only for those willing to pay the highest price. For every man who walked free, hundreds more fell in the sand. The arena was a crucible that burned away all but the strongest stand. Even they bore the scars forever. Not every gladiator accepted the brutal fate assigned to him beneath the chains and scars. A fierce spark of rebellion sometimes smoldered resistance, born from desperation, dignity, or defiance. The most famous of these uprisings was led by Spartacus, a Thracian gladiator, whose revolt shook the foundations of Rome and echoed through history as a testament to human will against oppression. Spartacus' rebellion began in 73 BCE, when about 70 gladiators escaped from Aludus in Capua. Armed with kitchen tools and makeshift weapons, they broke free, stealing wagons and rallying runaway slaves. Over 3 years, their ranks swelled to tens of thousands: farmers, slaves, prisoners, and desperate men, all united in a common cause: freedom from the chains of Rome. The revolt was more than a simple escape attempt. It was an organized, mobile army that fought multiple Roman legions, winning battles through cunning, discipline, and sheer determination. The rebels freed others along the way, ravaged estates, and challenged the very idea of Roman dominance. To the empire, it was a nightmare, a massive slave insurrection threatening the social order and economic backbone of the state. Spartacus himself became a legend, not just a gladiator, but a leader, strategist, and symbol of resistance. Ancient sources paint him as intelligent, charismatic, and relentless, but the revolt was doomed from the start. The rebels lacked resources, supplies, and unity. Political infighting and logistical struggles weakened their cause. In 71 BCE, the rebellion was crushed by Marcus Licinius Crassus, aided by Pompey's legions. Spartacus died on the battlefield, his body never found. Thousands of rebels were crucified along the Appian Way as a grim warning to others. The revolt ended, but its legacy lived, an enduring symbol of rebellion against tyranny. Spartacus was not the only gladiator to resist. Throughout Roman history, there were smaller uprisings, escape attempts, and acts of defiance. Some tried to flee during games or training, risking summary execution if caught. Others conspired to poison trainers or incite riots in the Ludi. Such acts were punished harshly, but they reminded Rome that even the most controlled slaves were not completely broken. Runaways faced brutal odds. The empire was vast, with patrols, informants, and laws designed to capture escapees. Even if a gladiator fled, life on the run was perilous, without shelter, food, or allies. Many were caught and returned to brutal punishment, sometimes worse than before. Yet the desire for freedom was strong enough to drive men to desperate measures. The memory of these rebellions haunted Rome. Emperors invested in more secure training facilities, harsher punishments, and propaganda that emphasized the futility of resistance. The games themselves became a tool to remind both slaves and citizens of Rome's absolute power. For the gladiators, rebellion was a double-edged sword, a chance at life, but also a death sentence if failed. Yet the very existence of defiance, the flash of courage in the eyes of men bound by chains, speaks to the enduring human spirit. In the arena's shadows, where death was routine, hope still flickered, sometimes bright enough to spark a revolution. As the centuries passed, the thunderous cheers that once echoed through Rome's grand amphitheaters began to wane. The gladiatorial games, once the empire's centerpiece of power and entertainment, slowly lost their grip on the hearts of the Roman people. What was once a symbol of might and control became increasingly controversial, unsustainable, and out of step with a changing world. Several factors contributed to this decline. Economic pressures mounted. The cost of staging lavish games, importing exotic beasts, maintaining training schools, and feeding fighters grew prohibitive. Emperors faced dwindling resources and rising internal strife, forcing them to prioritize military defense and public welfare over costly spectacles. The games, which had once unified the populace, increasingly strained the empire's coffers. Religious changes also played a decisive role. Christianity, spreading rapidly across the empire, condemned the games as barbaric and immoral. Christian emperors and bishops decried the violence, cruelty, and idolatry wrapped up in the spectacles. Christian martyrs who faced death in the arena became powerful symbols of faith and resistance, turning public opinion against the blood sports. By the 4th century CE, laws were passed restricting and eventually banning gladiatorial combat. Social attitudes shifted to whereas the empire's elite distanced themselves from the gritty violence, the games lost their prestige. The Roman public, while still hungry for entertainment, sought new forms of spectacle, chariot races, theatrical plays, and later, more subdued events. The arena's bloody pageantry was increasingly seen as a relic of a brutal past. The physical spaces of gladiatorial combat fell into disrepair. The Colosseum, once a marvel of engineering, suffered from neglect, earthquakes, and stone robbers who stripped its marble for new buildings. The ludi closed, their prisoners dispersed or executed. Gladiators vanished from public view, their stories fading into myth and shadow. Yet, the legacy of the games persisted. Gladiatorial imagery survived in art, literature, and folklore. The idea of the gladiator as a tragic hero, a slave turned warrior, continued to captivate imaginations through the Middle Ages and into modern times. The arena may have closed, but its shadow lingered. The end of the gladiatorial era marked more than just the cessation of brutal entertainment. It signaled a transformation in Roman identity, morality, and governance. The empire itself was changing, fragmenting, adapting, and slowly moving toward a new world order shaped by different values and beliefs. For the men who once fought beneath the blazing sun and jeering crowds, the fading of the arena was both a release and a loss. Freed from the chains of constant battle, they were also erased from history's main stage. The stone walls grew silent, and the sands grew cold. But beneath those stones, beneath the dust and ruin, the stories of those men and Durkos of lives lived on the razor's edge. Men who bled for an empire that would one day forget their names, but never their sacrifice. Long after the last trumpet sounded and the crowds dispersed, the ghosts of gladiators lingered in the shadows of Rome's ancient stones, beneath crumbling arches and weathered steps, beneath layers of dust and rubble. Their stories remained etched in silence, silent witnesses to a brutal past, both celebrated and forgotten. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves outside the city walls, shallow pits filled with broken bones and rusted weapons. Here lie thousands of men who fought and died anonymously, stripped of identity, discarded like refuse. Their remains tell a story of violence, endurance, and sacrifice that official records barely acknowledge. In the soil, fragments of helmets, bits of armor, and shards of pottery whisper secrets of lives ended too soon. Graffiti carved into the walls of the Colosseum and other arenas offer glimpses of the humanity beneath the helmets. Names, declarations of love or hate, prayers for victory or mercy, all scratched in haste or desperation by fingers that once gripped swords. These marks connect us across millennia to men who lived and died, not for glory, but to survive. The arena itself, once a stage of life and death, now lies in ruins. Yet its stones seem to breathe memory. Tourists walk its passages, imagining the roars and cries that once filled the air. But beneath the surface, the truth remains. The gladiator was not a hero, but a victim of spectacle. Not a conqueror, but a slave to fate. And still, in the quiet moments before dawn, when the city's noise dims and shadows lengthen, it's easy to imagine the fallen fighters rising from the sand ghosts of sweat and blood, of hope and fear, waiting for one last fight, one last chance to claim the freedom denied them in life. Their legacy is a somber reminder of the cost of entertainment, the price of power, and the resilience of the human spirit. The blood-stained sands of Rome's arenas may have been raked clean, but the echoes of the gladiators' struggles linger shadows on the stone, forever etched in the heart of history.